And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Mark Gober, author of the Upside Down series of 7 books spanning topics of consciousness science, spiritual awakening, politics, UFOs, medicine, cosmology, and more. He is a magna cum laude graduate of Princeton University, a former New York investment banker, and his latest book is An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, Rethinking Big Bang, Heliocentrism, the Lights in the Sky, and Where We Live. Mark, welcome back. It's been 2 years, and it's great to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
Well, for people who are just meeting you for the first time, how did you go from being a Princeton graduate and a former banker into all of this stuff?
It was very much unexpected. I was working in Silicon Valley back in 2016 and started listening to podcasts, basically. At the time, I was a mainstream thinker. I would have characterized myself as an atheist or agnostic. I thought that we lived in a universe that didn't have any meaning built into the fabric of reality. It was fundamentally random. There was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and then lots of physical particles bumped into each other, and then that led to the development of human beings who had brains, and out of their brains popped consciousness. So I thought that under that view, when you die, when your brain shuts off, that's the end of your consciousness. There's no afterlife. Any topics like that I would have considered superstitious, and that our science had moved us past it. So fast forward to 2016, I started to hear podcasts that challenged that worldview, and I haven't looked back really, but it started off, I was looking primarily at consciousness and near-death experiences and phenomena like that, which I'm still very much interested in. But as I looked at more and more paradigms beyond just the nature of consciousness, I saw there were many holes in the assumptions that I believed to be true. And it's led me down many different paths, most recently looking at cosmology.
Well, if you're questioning the Big Bang Theory, why should we all be questioning it?
Maybe where I would start is, why should we believe it? And what you asked is a profound question in many ways, because when we are told things by authorities, the knee-jerk reaction, especially among those who are educated, I found, highly educated, the knee-jerk reaction is to believe the experts. When in fact, it's the burden of proof is on the person putting forward a claim, especially if we're talking about something that allegedly happened 13.8 billion years ago in a very far away place. To think that we know what happened with any precision, it seems a bit egotistical to believe that we could actually know that. But beyond that, there are many holes in the typical Big Bang story. It's interesting, when I was an undergrad at Princeton, I thought about majoring in astrophysics. I ended up majoring in psychology, blending psychology with economics, so behavioral economics. But at one point, I was really hot on astrophysics because I took an astrophysics course, and they were talking about the nature of the cosmos. And in particular, they talked about the cosmic microwave background, which is a well-known phenomenon. It's the idea that we can measure currently radiation that came from the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. The problem is that there's some anomalies that I didn't learn about back at school. And what I find with all the topics I research is that sometimes there are inconvenient anomalies that people like to just sweep under the rug. Whereas now, if there's an anomaly that doesn't fit the model, that means we have to rethink everything, because a model that's comprehensive should be able to accommodate every observation. And with regard to this cosmic microwave background, again, the background radiation that still exists from the Big Bang, it is supposed to be homogeneous and isotropic, meaning it doesn't have a preferred direction. But there are these anomalies in the background radiation that are inhomogeneous and anisotropic, meaning that it has a preferred direction. So it doesn't match the prediction of what we'd expect based on this expanding universe model of a Big Bang. And this has disturbed some physicists so much that they've called it the axis of evil. Why is it an axis of evil? Because it points toward Earth as having a central place in the cosmos. So this harkens back to what some would call an ancient view on the cosmos, which is that it's geocentric, meaning that Earth is at the center, rather than the sun being at the center, which is the current model known as heliocentrism. And heliocentrism follows this Big Bang and billions of years of stuff flying around, and it ends up with Earth revolving around the sun. But this observation, among many others that I described in my book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, suggests that the observations point toward Earth as having a central place. And this violates what's known as the Copernican principle. The Copernican principle comes from this heliocentric model, which started with Nicholas Copernicus, and then Galileo. His observations in the telescope pointed us toward sun being at the center, heliocentrism. But the Copernican principle posits that Earth does not occupy a special place, that we are a speck in a massive universe, and we're just one of many. Versus the geocentric perspective, which is that Earth does occupy a special place. So the Copernican principle, which says we don't occupy a special place, has biased many of the astronomical observations that we see, including the whole model of the Big Bang and the expanding universe theory. Edwin Hubble, who was a big part of the expanding universe theory, even talked about the idea that we could exist in a geocentric universe, and he called it intolerable, a horror, an unwelcome position. And Stephen Hawking said that we accept the heliocentric idea, the Copernican principle, on principles of modesty. So there was this philosophical preference against any idea that we occupy a special place. It reminds me a lot of what I started off researching in the nature of consciousness, because the materialist view of consciousness, which says that everything's just a product of the brain and that when you die, it's over, it points us toward an atheistic perspective, that the human being's not special, the human being doesn't have any place beyond this body. And as you know, there's a lot of evidence to counter that, especially from near-death experience research, but many other things, psi phenomenon otherwise. It's very similar with cosmology. There's this preference, oh, we don't occupy a special place, we're just a speck in a random universe. Whereas there are some anomalies in the cosmological data which suggest that we do occupy a special place.
I like how Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about the Big Bang, and basically what he says is, what explosion do you know of that results in order? So, how did we get all this order out of the Big Bang?
What scientists would tell us is that it's randomness. And with enough events happening, chance tells us that you'll end up with a self-replicating molecule, which leads to the evolution of a human being. And it just happens over billions and billions of years. And we're expected to believe it. And this is a theme over and over again. It's sort of like we're asked to violate common sense often because an expert did some calculations and observed things and then came to conclusions and built a model around those observations. Whereas they might have observed things, sure, but that doesn't mean they have an accurate explanation for what they observed. And an example I give, the book I wrote before this is called An End to Upside Down Medicine, and I look at why do people get sick fundamentally. But this principle that I'll describe here applies to cosmology as well. If you imagine that a lot of people go to a party, and then after the party, a bunch of them get sick with similar symptoms. Many people will say, I caught something, meaning that there was a microscopic organism that went from person to person. And basically what they've done is they've come up with a model as to why they got sick. Really what happened is they came up with one hypothesis, which is a reasonable one to come up with, but there are many other reasons why someone could get sick. Maybe there were toxins in the environment. Maybe they all had a certain type of food poisoning. Maybe there was a lot of radiation of some kind. Maybe they all had an emotional trauma that caused their body to react a certain way. The point is we could come up with many examples, as many reasons as to why people get sick. Same thing goes with cosmology. And there's a very important logical fallacy that's worth keeping in mind here. It's known as affirming the consequent. The technical way of describing it is, if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. What's a simple example? If it rains, the grass outside will be wet. I observe that the grass outside is wet, therefore it rained. So that second sentence is highly problematic because it says we observed something and now we know what the answer is and why the grass was wet. Well, there are many reasons grass could be wet. Maybe there was dew. Maybe kids rolled by and poured water on it. Maybe there were interdimensional beings who popped in and poured water and then popped out. The point is we could come up with a million reasons why grass is wet other than rain. And what happens in many areas of science and even politics and beyond is that people observe things, they come up with a model to explain it. That becomes the default model. And then anything new that they observe, they force fit it into that model. And I think a lot of what we see in cosmology, including the Big Bang, suffers from this logical fallacy.
Do you feel that the Big Bang even happened, or all of this was created by consciousness?
I lean toward consciousness being fundamental, meaning that everything that we consider to be material is actually just consciousness. They're different modulations of consciousness, as Rupert Spira says. However, in terms of the mechanism by which consciousness has manifested this physical world, I really don't know myself. I'm highly skeptical of the Big Bang Theory, however, because for many technical reasons that I talk about in my book and many physicists who I quote, there are reasons to question the model that's put forth. There are many, many anomalies that actually don't match the model, including having to come up with basically imaginary particles that no one's found. One is known as an inflaton particle that helped with inflation in the early universe. This is known as the reification fallacy, basically describing something as if it's real and then continuing to use the term over and over again as if it's a real thing, even though it's purely hypothetical. So we end up with a lot of these things in cosmology. So was there even an inflaton particle? Well, you might need to have that particle to explain the Big Bang Theory. Otherwise, it falls apart. So you end up, what happens in science is that people plug things in order for it to work. So that's a long way of saying, Jeff, I don't exactly know the mechanism by which everything started, but I lean toward the idea that there is a consciousness beyond space and time that is the foundation of all reality.
You were talking about heliocentrism and geocentrism, but current science says that we're rotating around our sun, but then our sun is rotating around the galaxy. Mm-hmm. So I'm surprised at least they don't go with galactic centrism or something like that.
But even the notion of distant galaxies and the sun being 93 million miles away and so forth, there are, I would argue, inferences, that assumptions built into all of that. Whereas there are many reasons to question heliocentrism, one of which is the basic fact, which has been stated by Einstein, Stephen Hawking, and I quote many physicists in the book. They will admit that based on the things that we observe in the sky, you cannot tell whether we live in a heliocentric or a geocentric universe. It's known as a kinematic equivalence. But what's happened is the Copernican principle has taken hold and an entire cosmology has been built to fit heliocentrism, because heaven forbid Earth occupies a special place. Because if Earth occupies a special place or is even stationary and at the center of the cosmos, or at least at the center of what we can observe, maybe there was an intelligence that created all of this. And then you start to invoke spiritual and religious principles, which a lot of science doesn't like. So you're also reminding me of something that I used to just believe as a truth, because so many people said it, which is that Galileo firmly proved to us that heliocentrism is true, because he took out his telescope and he observed things. But what I didn't realize is that it was the same issue of affirming the consequent. He observed things that could be explained by heliocentrism, but they could be explained by geocentrism too. For example, he observed the phases of Venus, which are sort of like the phases of the moon, and said, well, that makes sense under heliocentrism. But it also makes sense under a form of geocentrism, where Earth is at the center, where there are a few bodies in the sky, the wandering stars known as planets, which go around the sun while the sun goes around Earth. That would explain the phases of Venus. So either the heliocentric or the geocentric works. Same thing goes for Galileo's observations of what he would have called a moons around Jupiter. The idea that there was a smaller body around a larger body. But just because we see things on the ceiling doesn't tell us what the floor is like. All we know is we observe things out there. It doesn't tell us anything about what our current place is. So a lot of this exercise is unwinding assumption after assumption. There are so many assumptions built into this notion of even galactic revolutions, that we're going around a galaxy. I'll pause there. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll pause.
Well, what about how science would say that, positions of planets are predictable? They know where Mars is going to be, like when they're launching rockets. How do you explain that?
I would say that just because a model can explain certain things doesn't mean that it's the correct model. In the same way that, yeah, it's true that if the grass is wet, it could have rained. That's one way to explain it, but there are other ways to explain it too. And so what's happened is, because we're so locked into this Big Bang heliocentric model, no one in mainstream science is even really considering a stationary geocentric Earth. So it's whatever happens, the observations are going to be made into a heliocentric model, even if there are anomalies that can't be explained.
Can you share with us some more of those anomalies?
Yeah, so I'll take it back to a very foundational study in 1887. This is known as the Michelson-Morley experiment, which is traditionally thought of as disproving the existence of an ether, which is used to be considered the fifth element, the substrate of all reality. And it also just further suggested that Earth is moving, that we rotate, revolve. In particular, they're talking about the revolution around the sun. But the Earth is moving in many ways, allegedly, that we rotate on an axis, we revolve around the sun, free falling at over 60,000 miles an hour. We move around the Milky Way galaxy, and we're expanding out in an expanding universe at over 1 million miles an hour, even though we feel none of that. That's what we're told. But actually, there are some physicists who look back at those studies and say, those studies were just interpreted in a very specific way, including Robert Bennett, PhD, who specializes in Albert Einstein's relativity theory. He says, actually, that 1887 study and others like it, they showed a small fringe shift, which suggests that there is an ether and Earth is stationary. But that's not something that many people have talked about. Instead, what happened is Albert Einstein came along after the Michelson-Morley study of 1887, and then Einstein's relativity became basically one of the primary theories of all of physics. And that takes us to another important anomaly, known as dark matter. So according to mainstream physics, 96% of the universe is mysterious stuff called dark matter and dark energy. That means only roughly 4% of the universe is stuff that we know. This is the mainstream cosmology. And when I was researching for this book, I looked into, well, what scientists don't really understand dark matter, but what's the origin of it? This is another anomaly. In 1933, there was an astronomer named Fritz Zwicky who was looking at the Coma cluster of galaxies. And based on what he was observing and based on the laws of Einstein's gravity, his general relativity theory, there was under 1% of the mass that should have been there. There was a lot of missing matter, basically. So instead of saying maybe we need to rethink gravity and Einstein's relativity, the scientists said we discovered dark matter. So it was plugged in to basically preserve the conventional thinking about motion. Now let me take another step back. Newton's gravity, which most of us think of as law. You drop an apple, it falls to the ground. The question is not whether the apple drops, it's why it drops. And Newton's gravity would say it has to do with the fact that mass has some special property that it attracts other mass to it. So Earth has a much bigger mass than the apple, so the apple falls down to Earth. That's what Newton's gravity basically says. The problem is that Newton's gravity as a comprehensive theory doesn't work. There are many things that don't work, including Mercury's motion around the sun in the sky. Newton's gravity doesn't predict that. So it is a model that is fundamentally unworkable because it can't explain that very important phenomenon. So Einstein's relativity, in addition to working with the Michelson-Morley study of 1887 and helping to reconcile that, Einstein's general relativity was supposed to be a more precise version of gravity, which says that it's not that mass is attracting mass, but mass is actually bending space-time. So then smaller things are moving to bigger things because of the bending of space-time. It's not really mass attracting mass. So that's the leading theory. But then you have to have dark matter in order for that to exist. Now, I want to read you a quote from an astrophysics professor named Pavel Krupa. In 2022, he said this. He's at the University of Bonn in Germany. He says very explicitly, the current cosmological model only works by postulating the existence of dark matter, a substance that has never been detected, but that is supposed to constitute approximately 25% of all the universe. And by the way, dark energy is a big percentage too. But he says, a simple test suggests that dark matter does not in fact exist. If it did, we would expect lighter galaxies orbiting heavier ones to be slowed down by dark matter particles, but we detect no such slowdown. A host of other observational tests support the conclusion dark matter is not there. The implications of this are nothing short of a revision of Einstein's theory of gravitation. And the subtitle of his article is Cosmology's Collective Delusion. So the point here is that the entire cosmology that we currently have is basically a house of cards. And that means we need to rethink everything, including gravity, which is central to the Big Bang heliocentric model.
You mentioned that Mercury's motion isn't what we think it is, I guess, basically. What's going on with Mercury?
It's that Mercury's motion is not predicted by Newton's gravity. So the way it moves in the sky, his equations can't predict, basically. So the point of mentioning it was Newton's gravity has a problem, even though most of us wouldn't know that because it's Newton's law of gravity. And then Einstein's relativity came along to basically be a more precise version of gravity. But then we run into the problem of dark matter.
Are you aware of the Israeli, I guess he was a general, Haim Eshed, that talked about UFOs and stuff?
Yeah, I believe he talked about a galactic federation. Is that right?
Well, the most fascinating thing I thought he talked about was that space is not what we think it is. And I'm curious what your definition of what space is.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I don't know exactly what he thinks it is, but what we've been told it is this massive vacuum, basically a low pressure system that's expanding at this incredible rate after a big bang. One of the problems with the idea of space as a vacuum is that it violates basic notions of pressure physics. And before my book was published, a theoretical physics PhD named Steve Young read it, and he has written about this stuff too. He's very skeptical of mainstream cosmology. His book's called The Fool's Wisdom, and he makes this argument in his book as well. If you open up a can of soda, there's usually a pop that you hear. And it's because inside the can of soda, there's high pressure of the gases moving around relative to the air around the soda can, which has lower pressure. So when you open up the can of soda, the higher pressure inside has to basically reach a form of equilibrium with the lower pressure outside. So the gas diffuses out until that equilibrium is reached. And because you open the can so abruptly, it makes that loud noise and goes through that little hole. That's basic pressure physics. Now, if we apply that to the way we think about Earth on a more cosmic level, Earth doesn't have an enclosure, according to mainstream cosmology, in the way that a can of soda is supposed to. It's closed until you open it up. You pop it open. And yet Earth is sitting next to this almost infinitely low pressure system, the vacuum of space. So we would expect Earth's atmosphere to effectively be sucked out. It would have to violently move out into the vacuum in order to reach that equilibrium, because we have a much higher pressure system on Earth than the vacuum of space, according to mainstream cosmology. And yet what we're told by mainstream physicists is that Earth's atmosphere peacefully coexists, even though there's this massive gradient, there's massive differential of the vacuum of space and Earth's atmosphere. This is a big problem. What is the excuse of mainstream physics? That somehow gravity holds it in. And we already discussed how gravity's got issues. But even if you believed in the mainstream view of gravity, gravity is supposed to be a pretty weak force, except at big scales. And we're dealing with gases that are way high up, that are far from the center of mass. So there are some people, including Stephen A. Young, theoretical physics PhD, who are saying we don't buy it. The only way we can think about space, first of all, is that Earth is somehow enclosed. We live in a closed pressure system. Now, what that would mean that there's some container that we don't necessarily see with our eyes, or we don't perceive it because human beings aren't going up into space. I mean, maybe a few are, government agencies, but ordinary people can't validate for themselves what's up there. So the idea is that there's some kind of enclosure, but what's beyond the enclosure? That's a question. Is it a vacuum, or is it some kind of fluid medium? Those who believe it's a fluid medium often refer to the biblical passage of waters above and waters below. The waters below meaning like the oceans, and waters above meaning there's a fluid medium that the lights we see in the sky, they're flowing through that. And there's a documentary done by the host of Crow 777 Radio where he was looking with his telescope at the bodies in the sky. And he calls them lunar waves, where if you look at the moon with his telescope, you can see almost what look like waves, as if the medium in which the moon is sitting is a fluid. And you can even see it beyond the moon almost. So it looks like the bodies in the sky might be in the fluid medium. I don't know for sure until we're out there. We can't necessarily validate it. But if there's a firmament enclosure or some kind of enclosure, then it raises questions about whether we could even go beyond that to know what space is.
Do you think there is some group of individuals out there who know what's going on and are lying to us?
This topic is really hard to approach without suggesting that at least some people are knowingly telling falsehoods, that they're lying. But I don't think every single person is. For example, there are probably many astrophysicists or even people who work at space agencies who are taking in data and applying the assumptions they were taught in school. Because to think about an enclosed Earth or gravity not being what we're told, Einstein's relativity being wrong, dark matter not existing, heliocentrism to be wrong. These are completely heretical ideas. And I could understand if you have a PhD that you might not be thinking about those core assumptions. But I don't know if there's any way that, especially with the existence of space agencies that are claiming to go to space under a cosmology that I think can be shown to be false, whether it's looking at dark matter or the cosmic microwave background or many other things I talk about in my book. The space agencies are assuming all that stuff is true when we can show that there are big problems with it. So there must be some people, and I don't know how many or who they are. I think there must be some who know there are falsehoods and are helping to cover it up. But I think the majority of people are innocently propagating falsehoods.
Does God play into your equation at all?
Absolutely. I think it depends on how we define God, first of all. I mean, I think of God as the infinite field of consciousness that we're all a part of versus a separate, individualized entity. And under the way I look at it, that there's this unified field of consciousness that especially if we exist in something that's like a geocentric universe, that we do occupy a special place, then I do think that fits into the notion of God very well, that there's something special about us and what we're doing here, and that things matter. Now, you could have heliocentrism with God too, and there are many heliocentric God believers, but it still invokes this idea that we are just a little speck, and maybe we are meaningful, but we're not quite as meaningful as if we occupy a central place. And I didn't believe in geocentrism until pretty recently. I hadn't even considered it. But I think once I've looked at the data and looked at all the things that have just been assumed to be Earth isn't special, and you see the anomalies over and over again, points very strongly, in my opinion, to not heliocentrism.
What then would cause the sun to rotate around the Earth?
So the question is basically, why do things move? The bodies in the sky and otherwise. So let me take a few steps back, because your audience might be wondering, well, okay, we know an apple falls to the ground. If it's not because mass attracts mass, it's not because mass is bending space-time, why is it? And let me preface by saying I feel much more comfortable in these conversations describing what appears not to be true versus saying I know this to be true with certainty. And that's an acceptable thing to do logically, because like I said before, positive claims are being put forth, meaning the burden of proof is on those who claim that thing to be true, and it's up to them to back it up. And if it can be falsified, that's fine. We don't need to have a replacement model. It's possible to be in a position of saying, I don't know. So I'm partially saying this from that position of I don't know with certainty. But there are many people who question the mainstream cosmology, including Steve Young, who I mentioned, who say that things fall down because of density, buoyancy, and electrostatics. So basically, an apple's denser than the air around it, and it falls. Helium gas is less dense than other air around it, and therefore it rises. The question then becomes, why is there a downward bias? So why would it be that the apple falls down just because it's denser? Why wouldn't it go sideways or something? And the answer, according to some, is that there is a downward electric current inherent on Earth. And Richard Feynman, a famous physicist, described this, and I quote him in my book, talking about this downward electric current. There are also some anomalies in studies on gravity, basically thunderstorms. During thunderstorms, things fall at different rates, which suggests that there could be an electrical component to things. There's also something known as the Hutchinson effect, which effectively enables levitation of large objects using electrostatics. And another important force is magnetism that we would want to consider for all this, whether it's why things fall or the bodies in the sky. It's possible that electricity and magnetism or electromagnetism, something like that could explain the motion. But the real answer is I don't know. And I think that until we can actually get out there and start to see it and have a lot of independent validation beyond just government agencies and a few private citizens, because we can't validate their information independently, it's going to be hard for us to know with certainty.
Is magnetism created by the mineral magnetite?
That's a good question, because so you're making me think about Earth's magnetic field, which my understanding is if you believe that Earth is a sphere, the belief is that there's a core of Earth at the center, even though no one's ever been there before. Earth has a radius value, if it's believed to be a sphere, at roughly 40,000 miles, even though we've only been able to dig down under 8 miles. So everything below us beyond that digging is really a guess. In any event, the guess is that there's a core, and the outer core, well, the inner core is supposed to be too hot to be able to generate a magnetic field, but the outer core rotates, and because of Earth's tilt, there's something known as the geodynamo effect, that Earth's magnetic field is generated that way, but the geodynamo effect has never been established. But your point also, I think it's probably true that there are materials that inherently have a magnetic property. But in terms of Earth's magnetic field itself, it's the geodynamo effect that's believed to create it, even though that's never been established.
Well, it sounds like that you're suggesting that the Earth is not a sphere. And if that's true, how do you debunk, footage from the ISS and stuff like that that shows that the Earth appears to be a globe?
The position that I describe in my book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, is one of globe skepticism, which is different than affirmatively saying, I know with certainty it's flat. I do think there are many observations that I describe in the book that work better on a flat topographical plane than they do on a sphere. But for many reasons, I don't think we can know with certainty what Earth's shape is. For example, we would need to dig down much further than roughly 8 miles to know what's below us, especially if it were a sphere. Ideally, if we had the technology, we'd be able to dig all the way down to the bottom and end up in the other end of space, because we're supposed to be a ball floating in space. We haven't been able to do that. In terms of space agencies, I'll talk about it in a second, but we would need to have a lot more independent validation beyond what NASA tells us. And furthermore, we don't have an ability to freely and privately explore all of Earth to know exactly what our map is. For example, there are some restrictions in terms of where you can travel in the North Pole, and most famously, the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 has restricted free and private access of Antarctica. And that's an important part of establishing whether Antarctica is an island floating at the bottom of a sphere, like the globe model says, or whether, as flat Earth proponents would say, is that Antarctica is not an island, it's actually a circular wall surrounding the flat Earth of Earth. That Earth is basically a circle, so it's round in a circular sense, not a spherical sense, where North Pole is at the center, and we're surrounded by an ice wall, and what's beyond the ice wall, we don't know what that is. That's the belief. The problem with that is, until we can explore Antarctica fully, we can't know with certainty. And sure, some people go to parts of Antarctica, but that's very different than exploring all of it in detail. It would be like saying, yeah, I went to the Marina District in San Francisco, and therefore I know all about North America. We need to know a lot more about Antarctica. But with that preface, there are some issues with the space agency observations too, and I have a whole chapter on this in my book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. If we wanted to prove the claim is that Earth is a spinning ball. We should be able to see that Earth is a spinning ball. So why isn't there footage, 24-hour footage, of Earth doing a full rotation from space as a sphere? You'd think, given that NASA has billions of dollars and many, many decades of work, and allegedly claims to have sent people to the moon and sends probes into distant space, that they could at least show footage of a sphere spinning. But instead, we get partial images. And almost always, they are CGI or composite images, meaning they're put together from multiple images, or artist renditions. The last pure image we're supposed to have of Earth comes from the alleged Apollo mission in 1972, the blue marble, but even that is a disk. It's a circle. We don't see a full sphere. But that image, the blue marble, which has been put on iPhones all over the world, has kind of been ingrained in our minds. I quote in my book the NASA artist who worked on it. He said it's photoshopped. He literally had to make parts of that image up. So I would say the more you look into this, Jeff, the more you realize we get partial images or artist renditions or these things that are composites, and we're asked to infer a full shape. But we would really need to have a full sphere that we can see, and we would love to see that moving from space in raw, continuous footage, but we don't have that. And even if we had it from just one agency, we'd want to have lots of independent validation. It's very strange that we don't have that, because the claim put forth is a spinning ball, and what do we not have? Complete direct evidence of a spinning ball.
Are you saying that even though if we look through the telescope and we see all the other planets out there are round, their moons are round, the sun is round, we, meaning the Earth, is something potentially completely different?
Well, I would say two things. One, we'd have to define round, because round could mean circular. It could be a circular disc. Like the moon is assumed to be a sphere, but we only see one side of it. We don't really know. So it could be a circular sphere. But more generally, a circular disk, not a circular sphere. But more generally, it would be a logical fallacy to say that because I observe things out there, we must be that same thing. It sort of has this model embedded in it that Earth is a planet in a solar system revolving around the sun, that we are one of these other planets and we are like them. That's a very heliocentric bias. This Copernican bias is built into it. But what if it is geocentric, that Earth is at the center and Earth is actually special in terms of what we are living on? Then we wouldn't even be a planet. We would be, some would say, a plane, whereas the planets are planets. They're wandering stars. We're distinct. We're not a planet. That's one possibility, is the point. So I would just say it's what we would need is direct evidence of Earth as a spinning globe, not these indirect pieces where we might infer it. For something so big, it would be nice to have really direct evidence.
I had Flat Earth Dave on before, and I didn't think of this question until after I remade the recording, but I wish I would have asked him, if the Earth is flat, we should be able to get to the top of the Empire State Building in New York, and with a powerful enough telescope, be able to see London straight across the Atlantic Ocean. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is getting to a broader category of basically how far we can see. And as discussed in my book, there are many people who have done observations which, based on the globe Earth maths calculation, should not be possible. In other words, if we live on a globe, there should be certain things that are blocked by Earth's curvature because they're below the curve and you literally can't see them. It would be like trying to see something that's around a bend. The mass of the bend is blocking it. And yet people repeatedly are seeing things that they should not be able to see. But this depends on many factors because it depends on your altitude. It depends on the atmospheric conditions too, because it might be harder to see things that are far away if it's very cloudy, for example, if there's a lot of smog. So depending on the observation, Jeff, and depending on the telescope, we'd have to look into that. There's also something known as the attenuation of light, which means you can't see forever. You think about light in a flashlight in fog. It dampens the light. So I would say for any of these observations, we'd have to look at all the conditions, look at what the globe map says versus what we actually observe, and do many replications of it. But we're not getting these replications beyond many independent researchers because the space agencies, I mean, at least I haven't seen it. It would be very easy for them to prove the sphere by saying, look, all these things should be blocked by miles and miles of curvature. Look, we can't see it. But I'm observing the opposite, where people are going out and saying, this should be blocked by miles of curvature, and I can see it. That's why I think this movement of globe skepticism, or even just believing flat Earth straight up, is not going away because people are observing things on their own. But even if you do observe things that should be below the curve, that does not prove Earth is flat. All it proves is that it is a flat or a topographical plane up to a certain point. I mean, technically, it could be a larger sphere, or it could be something else way beyond what we know. Until we observe that far out, we can't know. But it would still be extremely damaging to mainstream cosmology, even if Earth were a bigger sphere, to see things that should be blocked by the curve. Because if Earth were a bigger sphere, for example, that would mean the radius value is much bigger than what we're told, which means that its mass is much bigger than what we're told. And mass is what plays into mainstream cosmology's gravity, that we're in this perfect balance of all the different masses lining up. And that's why this revolves around this. And if the Earth's mass is off, that would have a domino effect on all of cosmology. So the point here is that these anomalous observations are extremely damaging to the mainstream, whether or not they firmly prove flat Earth or not.
Would you say that you're 100% on board with the flat Earth, or are you just at a point where you're not 100% that we are a globe?
Yeah, much more the latter, that there's so much evidence challenging the globe model. Actually, on my Instagram account, it's Mark Gober, author. I sometimes talk to artificial intelligence, and I put some of this stuff in. Because if you start off by asking, is Earth a spinning globe, it's going to tell you yes. But I walk the AI through the logic of dark matter and the implications of what this means for gravity and the fact that we don't have any continuous footage of a spinning globe. And the answer it came back with was, there's a 0% chance we live on a spinning globe. And interestingly, just as a side note, I said, well, didn't you know about this dark matter falsification? Why didn't you tell us that? And it said, actually, I did know about it. And it's very disturbing because I didn't tell you. And that means I'm misleading many people. So if your audience is interested, check out my Instagram to see what AI said. But that's just one point out of many. I mean, I start my book off with the dark matter falsification. That's like the first page, and there's a lot more reason to question it beyond that. So to me, the spinning globe cosmology, it depends on too many things that aren't proven. But do I believe it's flat with certainty? Like I said before, there are many observations that fit way better on a flat Earth. All the ancient cosmologies, by the way, they were flat and geocentric. So I think that's very compelling. But as someone, I'm putting this stuff out there, and I want to be very precise. We need to observe Antarctica better. We need better mapping of Earth. We need more independent observations of what's above. Because theoretically, if Earth is a flat plane, we should be able to get high enough. If you could escape a firmament, we'd have to observe that too. But if you could, to show that it's a continuous plane that just goes on really far beyond an Antarctic ice wall, which is what some people believe, that there are other lands beyond the ice wall. But we can't do those observations, and we haven't been able to dig down far enough. So, if I'm going to ask for direct evidence of the spinning globe, I think we need to have the same standard for an alternative model. But to me, the first step is to say the spinning globe model has problems, and that's not where mainstream cosmology is. And often people who even question this stuff, they get called names. But then I would say, explain to me dark matter. Or in my book, I quote Michio Kaku, mainstream physicist, who talks about how mainstream physics cannot reconcile the two leading theories, Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics. Two massive theories. When you put them together, the equations metaphorically blow up. And to paraphrase what Michio Kaku says, and I quote him in the book, he says, we end up with the biggest mismatch in science. We're off by a factor of 10 to the 120th power. So by its own standards, mainstream cosmology and mainstream physics is getting it very wrong. And to those who want to say, and I hear this all the time, and I wanted to say it, well, mainstream cosmology can explain so much so well. Why would we want to depart from it? No, it can't. It can't explain the leading theories of physics. It can't explain dark matter. We don't understand why the apple falls to the ground. There's so much that we can't explain with it. And I think starting from that place, hopefully will open minds and then bring us to what could be a very empowering place. Because if we are in a more central place in the cosmos, and we are maybe a creation of some big intelligence, that might help us rethink things. And if the ether is real, then we start to get into the territory of Tesla, who was talking this way. Maybe there are technologies that are being hidden by mainstream cosmology because they believe in a moving Earth with no ether, whereas the alternative is there is an ether and we're stationary. This goes back to the 1800s, like I said before, the Michelson-Morley study, and also the Airy's study, which is known as Airy's failure. But if you look at it from another standpoint, it's Airy's success, pointing toward an ether and a stationary Earth. Then maybe there are ether-based technologies that could make this a much better place.
What's popular on my channel lately is that the idea of us living in a simulation. What do you think about that?
How would you define simulation?
Well, it's something that's, whether it's created by a computer or by consciousness, this is not true reality. This is something that's false.
I tend to agree with that broad definition, that we see this so many times with people who are in states of expanded consciousness, whether it's a near-death experience or psychedelics or alien abduction phenomena or other mystical experiences through meditation or otherwise, or dream phenomena. People will say that what I experienced cannot be described with language. It's ineffable. And there is some reality that's beyond this one. I've just seen too much of that. And given all the problems that I think we have with mainstream cosmology, mainstream neuroscience, and everything, to me, it's not a far reach to think, okay, maybe there is an extended reality beyond what our eyes ordinarily perceive, and it's part of some broader consciousness. And I lay out that hypothesis, the idea of consciousness not coming from the brain and a broader consciousness in my first book, and Into Upside Down Thinking. So I'm pretty squarely in that camp that we've got to rethink consciousness. Therefore, it wouldn't be a big stretch if we are part of some bigger consciousness, bigger intelligence, and we're not ordinarily perceiving it, that something seems to be blocked from our perception until we have extended states of consciousness through a near-death experience or otherwise, that something's being hidden, or that the reality we ordinarily perceive is not the full reality, and that there's some intelligence behind it. And then automatically we're in the realm of simulation at that point. Now, how it works and what the mechanisms are, I don't fully understand. I mean, I've taken a general position. I don't think it's precise, but the idea comes from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who says that all reality could be likened to a stream of water, an infinite stream, where water's like consciousness, and each of us is a whirlpool within that stream. We're both individual and collective at the same time, basically. Your identity as Jeff is a whirlpool, but also you're the entire stream. And as the entire stream, that is the basis of all physical reality. So if there's any simulation, it would mean that the underlying stream of consciousness is what is simulating itself effectively, meaning that we as individuals, as part of that, are effectively simulating ourselves. So the simulator is the simulatee from that viewpoint. But there could be layers. It could be a multidimensional stream, multidimensional whirlpool where there are simulations on simulations. I really don't know, other than I think that we live in a much stranger reality that we've been told. And I'll just mention one thing before I pause here is the Mandela effect. Very intriguing. The idea that events once remembered to be true are no longer true. And the mainstream skeptical response would be, well, that's just people misremembering. The alternative is, no, reality actually shifted, like glitches in the Matrix. And one example is the line from Star Wars, Luke, I am your father. That's not the line. The line is, no, I am your father. So did reality shift, or are we just misremembering it? I don't know, but these are the sorts of things that I think have to be considered.
What do you think about the soul trap theory?
Been thinking about this a lot. When I first studied near-death experiences, it didn't come up on my radar at all. I didn't even hear the theory in any of the research from the leading thinkers. Most near-death experiences, as you and your audience know, are positive. A small percentage are negative and hellish. Those are not well understood at all by the researchers. So I end up in a place actually wondering, is there a uniform system of life and afterlife for every soul, or is it different? Could it be a mixture? Could it be that some souls are trying to evolve through some kind of discernment where they have to see through something, and if they don't, they will be trapped, whereas other souls don't go through that? Is it a uniform system for every soul? I don't know. The problem with all this is we enter the realm of what I think is unverifiability. We can make arguments as to why there's a trap, and the reason that we have amnesia and reincarnate is because of a nefarious force exclusively. But I don't know if we could prove that. I don't know if we can, or if we could prove it uniformly. Like I said, it could happen for some people. But even the notion of a soul trap, as I think about it, those who espouse it often talk about home being beyond the trap, which has this notion of, or at least the connotation of benevolence beyond the trap. And if that's true, then that would suggest to me as an inference that we live, the broader reality beyond where we are is benevolent. And if we're part of that, then even a soul trap could be considered something that's benevolent, in that it's forcing us to learn and discern past the trap. And in that sense, we're growing, which could sound masochistic from one lens, but it could just be a mechanism of growth. Doesn't mean it's easy or pleasant. So that's a long way of saying I'm really not sure. And I think on both sides of this, it's hard to prove it. And I do worry sometimes about the, if you want to call it extreme blackpilling, of just like overly negative thinking about the reincarnation process, and that everything is a psyop manipulation, is that you end up in a place of almost like love is a manipulation. Because that's often what's said, is that you get a love bomb and it's not actually real when you die, and that ends up manipulating you. It becomes dangerous territory where then you think love is actually not real. And it makes me wonder if some element of the soul trap is its own kind of deception to make us want to depart from love and depart from legitimate experiences that some people have, that they can't even use words to describe, that describe an accurate representation of what's next. So it's a highly complex topic, and I wish I had a better answer for you, but I just don't think it's as black and white as some would like it to be.
Did you happen to watch any of the UFO hearings last week?
I didn't watch them, but I heard snippets.
It seems like that a lot of the talk is about underwater crafts, and maybe ATs or have bases underwater, or I don't know. I was curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'm open to it because there's so much of the ocean floor that's been unexplored. I mean, I didn't even mention that before when I talked about mapping out Earth. What's below us in terms of just the water, not below ground, what's even in the oceans. So much we don't know. I'm open to it. I'm also skeptical of anything that comes from the government, because the history, and I wrote about this in my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, is that the government has been deceptive on this topic. So even if the government starts to reveal some truths, I wonder if they're being steered in a certain direction, or if it's some truths with some falsehoods, or if they're only telling us certain truths so that they can cover up lies, and they're staging it. And It just makes me skeptical. I would say I always take in what they're saying. I think it's great people are talking about it, but I always worry that the narrative can be manipulated, especially around fear, because if there can be we saw this starting in 2020 when fear is manipulated in a certain direction, the population can be controlled and they can become controllable. And if there is all of a sudden this threat of ET beings, I would wonder how governments would weaponize that, even if there is an actual threat, how they'd weaponize it to control the population. But also, as I talk about in my contact book, I think there's a wide range of intelligences, some seemingly benevolent, others not benevolent, others that are tricksters and shapeshifters, and others in between. So to get into this like monolithic view, which I sometimes hear, that all the beings are here as a threat, that misses a lot of nuance.
Well, do you think we're in a spiritual war?
Absolutely. And one of my chapters in my Cosmos book is on the spiritual war, that there seems to be dark and light. And to your question before, are we being lied to? And I do think at some level we are being lied to. And it's not just cosmology. I talk about it in my book on medicine with regard to the germ theory of disease, talk about it in my book on consciousness and end upside down thinking. And politically, there's so many areas where we seem to be deceived, where the default message that we're all taught in school, which is often counterintuitive and it defies our common sense, that model ends up being incorrect when we look at the assumptions. Just think about the notion of a stationary Earth. If we knew nothing from any scientists, we were told nothing by anyone, we would believe we live on a stationary place. We never see down and away curvature. We see circularity, which is different than down and away spherical curvature. Circularity in our vision has to do with the way we see at a distance. It's called the azimuthal grid of vision, where we actually perceive in a dome. But that's not a down and away curvature, which is what you would need on a globe, because theoretically we're at the top of the globe all the time, and it should be curving down and away. We never actually perceive that. We never perceive any motion. We would probably say, yeah, we live on some kind of really big place that is stationary. That's just one example, but the experts have told us otherwise, and they can give us fancy mathematical equations, and we're supposed to believe that. I think this is part of a spiritual war. I really do, where we are being deceived and we're being put into a place of ignorance, where these topics, like the ones you cover, which probably should be taught to people at a young age, they are just these alternative media YouTube channels. Why isn't this fundamental stuff that everyone's being taught all the time, or at least being taught to question? It seems that we are in a place where ignorance is the default, and part of our journey evolutionarily is to break free from that.
Well, if people want to find out more about your new book, should they go to a website or Amazon?
The book is on Amazon. It's available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible. I am the narrator of the Audible, and all my books are available in those three formats. My book is, my website is my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. It has information about all 7 of my books and also my podcast series, which is called Where Is My Mind? That was released in 2019. It's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and it talks about near-death experiences, children with past life memories. I interviewed many of the leading scientists in those areas. So even though it was one season in 2019, it's still relevant information.
Do you have a new book coming?
I'm taking a break right now. The cosmology book came out pretty recently, and I would love to get it to more people. And what I found is that those who have read it, especially people who don't have a strong preconceived idea, are coming back to me saying, wow, I had never thought about that before. This is really changing how I think about things. And my experience of it, because my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, has a picture of a globe on the cover. And I wasn't trying to make a point about anything. It was one of these deeply ingrained beliefs I never thought to question. But it has been very liberating for me. And I've heard this from others. There's something maybe within ourselves, within our consciousness, that perhaps knows if we're living within a falsehood. There's some part of us that knows, this isn't right. And liberating myself from what I now believe to be falsehoods has made me feel more liberated, feel lighter. And it's also helped me develop logical tools of analysis to evaluate many other things that I think might not be true. It's this approach of, if you're telling me something is true, what the world is telling us a certain thing is true, I don't say, okay, I just accept it. I want to know, okay, show me the evidence. Why do you believe that's true? What are the assumptions underlying it? And then evaluating those assumptions. That's an approach that I've started to apply, and that's been really helpful for me.
Does your research ever psychologically bother you? You know, looking at all this stuff, seeing falsehoods, potential deceptions, So many errors out there. Does it weigh on your soul?
I've had ups and downs in this journey. When I first realized that there's a lot of evidence suggesting there's an afterlife and that consciousness extends beyond the body and psychic phenomena are real, this was 2016, I was completely disoriented. It was like too much at once. And I didn't have anyone to talk to. I didn't know there were so many people out there who already believed this stuff. But in my network of Silicon Valley, finance, Princeton, this was not a common way of looking at things. So that was really tough, and it took me a while to just develop the comfort to talk about it. Then I wrote my first book and ended Upside Down Thinking. But then since then, I've looked at other paradigms that have been very disturbing, especially many of these deceptions. And at first they're unsettling. It's a little bit scary to realize, wow, we live in a place where maybe there are really dark energies. When people talk about demons and possession, maybe that stuff's real. And I write about that in some of my books. But I've gotten to the point now where I'm almost numb to that. And I'm just interested in the truth. I almost expect that if there's a paradigm put forth, especially if it's really esoteric, so if it's something at a huge scale or something at a microscopic scale, that's when a lot of fudging can happen. And I talk about this a lot in my book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, which might be of interest to your audience.
Mark, before we wrap it up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
My message would be that in my own experience, it has been extremely liberating to try to uncover falsehoods. And I say uncover falsehoods rather than reveal truths, because I don't really feel like I know what the truths are. But using the Vedic terminology, neti, not this, not that, that's actually the way to enlightenment under that way of thinking about things, is that you narrow down the field of truths by getting rid of falsehoods. So the field of possibility becomes narrower and narrower as the falsehoods are broken down. And I have enjoyed that process, and I would encourage members of your audience, if they're interested, to just apply that approach. Anything that's told to you, whether it's on the news, in politics, in economics, science, something is told to you, look at what they're saying, look at how they arrived at it, and often you will find that there are so many inferences built in to what they're saying.
Mark, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.